Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at, this pretty intense topic
Yeah.
that's been in the news lately. The UK's decision to ban puberty blockers for kids experiencing gender dysphoria.
Right.
And
Big topic.
it is a big topic. It's gotten a ton of attention. We're going to be using a Reddit discussion that has a lot of different viewpoints,
Okay.
as well as an article from STV News to break it all down for you.
Sounds good.
So what's interesting here is this ban only applies when puberty blockers are being used for gender dysphoria, not for other medical reasons.
Interesting.
So we're going to try to figure out why that is.
Yeah, what's the rationale behind that, and what are people saying about it?
Exactly. What's the rationale? What are people saying about it? What are the potential consequences? So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the debate, can you give us like a quick, puberty blockers 101, what are they and how do they work?
Yeah, so puberty blockers, also called GnRH agonists, work by basically stopping the messages from the brain to the gonads. They block those messages.
Gotcha.
So it disrupts the kind of normal hormonal cascade that would happen in puberty and stops those key hormones like testosterone and estrogen from being released.
So it's not like a simple pause button.
Right.
There's like some serious biological stuff going on here to make this happen.
Because of that, because they're working at the level of those hormones, they basically stop all of the normal changes that you associate with puberty. So periods, breast development, voice deepening, facial hair, all of that stuff.
Okay, so we've got a handle on how they work now.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn that puberty blockers aren't only used for gender dysphoria.
That's right.
Right.
They have a good track record in other areas of medicine, too.
Okay.
Like if you think about precocious puberty, which is where a child starts puberty way too early, sometimes as young as 5 years old.
Wow.
Puberty blockers can be used to give that child's body a chance to develop at a more normal pace.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's get to the why of this decision.
Why the UK has decided to ban puberty blockers specifically for kids with gender dysphoria.
Right.
Well, so the UK government made this decision based on advice from the Commission on Human Medicines,
Okay.
the CHM.
Okay, the CHM.
And they raised concerns about what they called an unacceptable safety risk to children. And they also pointed to a lack of strong evidence that puberty blockers are actually effective for treating gender dysphoria long term.
Wait, so they're saying there's not enough evidence? What about all the research that's been done on this?
Well, yeah, and that's where it gets a little bit complicated because there is research out there.
Okay.
But the CHM seems to be saying that it's just not strong enough to justify those potential risks.
Gotcha.
Particularly when we're talking about young people whose bodies are still developing.
And so just to be clear, this is not a temporary measure.
Right.
This is like a full-on indefinite ban.
That's right.
For now.
Yeah. Although there is supposed to be a review of the decision in 2027.
Okay.
But for now, yeah, it's a hard stop on prescribing puberty blockers for gender dysphoria in kids.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It is.
And it sounds like this decision didn't just come out of thin air.
No.
Didn't they already have some reviews happening with their gender identity services?
They did, yeah. So this ban follows on from a big review of those services in the UK led by Dr. Hilary Cass, which had already led to pauses on new prescriptions for puberty blockers.
Right.
So it's all part of a larger trend, I think, that we're seeing in the UK.
Okay. So there's some history here.
Okay.
Now let's get into the arguments for and against the ban.
Yeah.
Looking at this Reddit discussion that you pulled, those who are for the ban seem to be echoing a lot of those concerns we just talked about from the CHM.
Right.
Worries about side effects.
Yeah.
And that lack of solid evidence supporting the long-term effectiveness of puberty blockers for gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and when you look into those concerns about side effects, there are some pretty serious issues being raised.
Like what?
So, for instance, they talk about things like bone density and sexual development, which are definitely things we need to be careful about, especially in kids whose bodies are still growing.
Those sound like some serious concerns.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that's where the unacceptable safety risk label comes from.
Yeah.
But what about that argument that a lot of people bring up about kids growing out of it? I've heard that one a lot.
You hear that one a lot, yeah. And you'll often hear the statistic that 80% of children who identify as transgender.
80%?
Yeah.
Wow.
Eventually stop identifying as transgender after going through puberty naturally.
So 80%, that's a huge number.
It is a big number, yeah.
But does that really tell the whole story?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Right.
And it's a statistic that comes with a lot of caveats and debate.
Okay.
Critics say that it's often taken out of context. And it doesn't really account for the nuances
Right.
of how gender identity develops in young people.
Right, because it's not just black and white.
Exactly. And they
Right.
point out that a lot of the studies
Right.
that this statistic is based on may be outdated or flawed in some way.
Okay.
So it's a big point of contention.
Gotcha. It makes sense that there would be some nuance to a stat like that.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as kids will grow out of it.
Yeah.
There are all these other factors at play.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that statistics, while useful, don't always capture the full picture of individual experiences.
Okay, so let's explore some of the arguments against the ban then.
Sure.
What are people saying on that side of the issue?
Well, one of the strongest arguments against this ban is about the distress experienced by transgender children who are forced to go through puberty that just doesn't align with their gender identity.
Yeah, I mean, going through the wrong puberty would be incredibly difficult physically and emotionally.
It's not just difficult for some. It can be utterly devastating.
Wow.
The Reddit thread is full of these heartbreaking stories from people who talk about experiencing really intense dysphoria, engaging in self-harm, and even having suicidal thoughts because they felt so trapped in the wrong body.
Those stories are so powerful.
Yeah.
And they really highlight the human cost of this decision.
They do, and they show why so many people are really fiercely opposed to this ban.
Yeah.
It's about respecting the lived experiences of transgender individuals, especially those who are most vulnerable.
And speaking of those personal stories, they seem to really dismantle that 80% desistance argument.
They do.
Don't they?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about whether someone's feelings will change. It's about the pain and suffering they might experience in the meantime.
Yeah, and one of the key arguments against the ban is that puberty blockers can actually buy valuable time for young people to explore their gender identity without that added pressure and distress of going through these unwanted and often irreversible physical changes.
So it's like hitting that pause button you were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Giving them that space to figure things out without their body changing in ways they don't want.
Yeah, it's about providing options and support, not forcing them down a path that might not be right for them. And it's worth noting that even if someone does decide to stop taking puberty blockers, their body will typically just resume its normal pubertal development.
Okay.
So it's not a permanent decision.
That's really important to point out. It's not like a one-way street.
Exactly.
But even with that option, some are worried about some of the unintended consequences of this ban.
Yeah.
So what are you hearing on that front?
Well, one major concern is that this ban might actually push people towards less safe options.
Okay.
You know, there's a worry that it could lead to an increase in black market access to puberty blockers, where there's no medical supervision or quality control.
So taking away that safe option could push people into riskier situations.
Exactly. And that's not the only concern. Some argue that this ban sets kind of a dangerous precedent for how healthcare decisions get made.
Oh, how so?
Well, it raises this question. Are we going to start restricting access to health care based on ideology or personal beliefs rather than on solid scientific evidence?
That's a huge question that goes way beyond just this issue.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, where does personal belief end and scientific evidence begin when we're talking about healthcare policy?
It's a crucial question and one that we need to grapple with as a society.
Yeah, we're talking about people's lives and their well-being here.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole situation so complex.
Right, this goes way beyond just puberty blockers.
Yeah.
It's about how we as a society approach healthcare.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to these sensitive topics like gender identity.
Right, it's about this complex interplay between individual experiences, medical knowledge, and societal values.
Right.
And this UK decision has brought all of those things into sharp focus.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this isn't just a UK issue.
Right.
This debate about transgender healthcare and puberty blockers is happening all over the world.
Globally, yeah.
So how does the UK's stance on this compare to what's happening in other places?
Yeah, it's a global conversation. And while some countries are taking a similar approach to the UK, others are going in a totally different direction.
Okay.
Like take France, for example.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned them earlier.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear more about what's happening in France.
Well, France actually recently released these new guidelines that go completely against what the UK is doing.
Okay.
Their approach is based on this growing body of research that suggests that gender-affirming care, including the use of puberty blockers in some cases, can be life-saving for some young people.
Wow. So it sounds like there's no global consensus on this.
No, not at all.
each country's making its own decisions based on a bunch of different factors.
Yeah.
Scientific findings, cultural norms, political pressures.
You got it?
It's a complicated landscape.
It is.
And I think it'll be interesting to see how these different approaches play out over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It definitely makes you think,
It does.
if countries with similar resources and healthcare systems can reach such different conclusions,
Right.
it shows just how complex this issue is.
It really highlights the need for thoughtful dialogue,
Yeah.
both within and between countries, to try and find the best way forward for everyone involved.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
setting the stage for a deeper dive into the heart of this issue.
Yeah.
But before we go any further, I want to pause and ask you, the listener, what are your thoughts on what we've discussed so far?
Yeah.
What are your initial reactions? What stands out to you? Hold on to those thoughts, and we'll be back soon to continue our exploration.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how this is all playing out, on this international level.
Yeah.
And you mentioned France's approach, which seems to be very much focused on harm reduction,
Right.
prioritizing that access to care and support for transgender youth. They seem to be placing a lot of weight on the potential benefits
Right.
of early intervention,
Yeah.
really emphasizing the distress and the potential long-term harm that can come from denying that care.
Yeah, so it sounds like they're taking a more proactive approach.
Yeah.
Kind of recognizing those potential risks of delaying or denying care.
Right.
Which is like a stark contrast to what we're seeing in the UK.
Yeah.
Which seems to be more about minimizing the potential risks of the treatment itself.
Exactly. And I think that really highlights the tension at the heart of this whole debate. It's this classic example of the precautionary principle versus a harm reduction approach.
Yeah.
So in the UK, they seem to be erring on the side of caution, prioritizing those potential unknowns and long-term risks of the puberty blockers themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas in France, they're much more focused on addressing that immediate and very real suffering that a lot of transgender youth are experiencing.
So it's this balancing act.
Yeah.
Between, protecting kids from potential future harm,
Right.
but also addressing their current
Needs
and experiences.
And it seems like each country is trying to strike that balance a little bit differently.
Right, and to make things even more complicated.
Yeah.
There's no simple answer here.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. The right approach is probably going to vary.
Yeah.
Depending on the individual. There's specific circumstances, their support system.
Yeah.
But navigating those nuances within a healthcare system is really challenging.
It's definitely not an easy issue, and it's one that's become so politicized.
It has.
As we've seen in the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all of the rhetoric and the emotional arguments.
It is.
But I think it's important to try to approach this with a level head.
Yeah.
And to really engage with the complexities of both sides.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond just taking sides and shouting at each other.
Right.
This is about real people's lives, and it deserves a more nuanced and compassionate conversation.
Well said. So let's dive a little deeper into some of those nuances.
Right.
So, we've talked about the arguments for and against the ban.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the broader ethical considerations at play here. What about informed consent?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about children.
Informed consent, that's a big one.
Right.
And it's really thorny in this context.
Yeah.
So, those who are against the ban argue that if a child with the support of their parents and their medical team understands the risks and the benefits of puberty blockers and chooses to take them, that decision should be respected.
Right.
They see it as a fundamental right to bodily autonomy, even for minors.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
children, especially those going through puberty, might not fully grasp
Yeah.
the long-term implications of these decisions.
Right.
Especially when we're talking about something as complex as gender identity.
Exactly. That's the counter argument.
Right.
And it's not an unreasonable one.
Right.
Critics of this early medical intervention are often worried about the potential for regret later in life.
Right.
Especially given that, our understanding of gender identity and how it develops is still evolving.
And it's that evolving understanding part that really complicates things.
It does.
Because if the science is still developing, how can we be sure that any decision made now whether it's for or against treatment,
Yeah.
is truly in the best interest of that child?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think anyone has a definitive answer to that.
Right.
But I think that's where open communication and a strong support system become even more crucial.
So it's about having honest conversations with the child, involving medical professionals with expertise, and carefully weighing those potential benefits and risks on a case-by-case basis.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, and each situation has to be assessed individually.
It does.
Which must be incredibly challenging for both the families and the medical professionals.
Absolutely. It is.
Involved.
Yeah, and it's a responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly.
Right.
It's about recognizing that this is a deeply personal decision, and often a life-altering one, that requires sensitivity, expertise, and a real commitment to acting in the best interest of the child.
Right.
And, sometimes that might mean being incredibly cautious.
Okay.
And other times it might mean being willing to support a child's desire to explore their gender identity more freely.
So where does that leave us? We've talked about the UK ban, the differing global approaches, the arguments on both sides, the complexities of informed consent.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface of this issue.
We have, and it's a testament to the complexity of the issue that we could spend hours discussing it.
Right.
And still only just scratch the surface.
Right.
But I do want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about those personal stories in the Reddit thread.
Right.
Those anecdotes, particularly the ones about self-harm and suicidal thoughts, really highlight the intense emotional and psychological toll that gender dysphoria can take.
They do, and it's a reminder that this isn't just some abstract debate about policy or statistics. This is about real people's lives, their well-being, and their right to live authentically.
Exactly, and I think it's important to remember that even though there's all this disagreement about the best way to support transgender youth, ultimately everyone involved in this debate, at least in principle, wants what's best for these kids.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Even with all the disagreements and the strong opinions, everyone is coming at this from a place of concern, albeit with very different perspectives.
Of course.
On how to express that concern.
Right. And I think recognizing that shared concern, that desire to protect and support young people, is a really crucial starting point for having those more productive and compassionate conversations.
It's about finding that common ground even amidst the disagreements.
Exactly.
And I think it's also about acknowledging that there's still a lot we don't know about gender identity and its development.
Absolutely. And that uncertainty, while challenging, shouldn't be used as a reason to shut down conversations or to deny care. It should actually motivate us to learn more, to listen to the experiences of transgender individuals and their families, and to approach this issue with humility and a willingness to adapt our understanding as new information comes to light.
It sounds like what we need is a much more nuanced and empathetic approach to this whole issue.
We do.
One that acknowledges the complexities of gender identity, the needs of each individual child, and the evolving nature of our understanding. But achieving that kind of nuanced approach in the current political climate seems like a tall order.
It does, but it's a goal worth striving for. It is, and it starts with recognizing that this isn't just a political issue. It's a human issue. It's about people's lives, their identities, their right to live authentically.
It's about seeing each other, hearing each other, and recognizing that shared humanity that connects us even across those disagreements.
Beautifully put. And perhaps in recognizing that shared humanity, we can start to bridge those divides and work together to create a world where all young people, regardless of their gender identity, feel safe, supported, and empowered to be their true selves.
That's a powerful vision, and one that I think we can all aspire to.
Absolutely.
And as we continue to grapple with these complex issues, I think it's important to hold on to that vision, to remember the human stories behind the headlines, and to approach each other with compassion and understanding.
I couldn't agree more. And with that in mind, let's shift our focus a little bit to some of the scientific and medical aspects of this conversation. We've talked about the concerns from the CHM about the safety and efficacy of puberty blockers,
Right.
but what does the research actually say?
Yeah.
And how do we weigh those potential risks against the potential benefits?
Right.
Let's delve into those questions as we continue this exploration.
Sounds good. All right, so we've been having this discussion about puberty blockers,
Yeah.
especially with this UK ban.
Right.
But let's zoom in on the science for a sec.
Okay.
What does the research actually tell us
Yeah.
about how safe and effective these are?
That's where it gets kind of tricky
Okay.
because it's not like there's this one big study
Right.
that gives us all the answers.
Yeah.
The research on puberty blockers,
Yeah.
especially for gender dysphoria, is still ongoing.
So it's not as clear-cut as some people make it sound.
Oh, definitely not.
Okay.
There are studies that suggest that they can be helpful,
Okay.
in alleviating gender dysphoria,
Yeah.
improving mental health
Okay.
for some transgender youth.
Mm-hmm.
And these studies often point to the relief that comes from preventing those physical changes
Right.
that don't align with a person's gender identity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you're struggling with gender dysphoria,
Yeah,
going through the wrong puberty
right.
could be really distressing.
Exactly. And that distress can have,
Yeah.
serious consequences.
Yeah, and it's not just hypothetical either.
Right.
We saw that in those personal stories.
Exactly. Remember those stories from the Reddit thread.
Yeah.
Many of them described feeling trapped in their bodies,
Yeah.
which led to, self-harm, depression, even suicidal thoughts.
Those stories were heartbreaking.
Yeah.
They really showed how this debate is impacting real people.
Exactly. And they highlight why a lot of healthcare providers believe that offering puberty blockers as an option
Yeah.
can be so important for some young people.
Yeah.
It gives them that time and space to explore their gender identity
Cool.
without those physical changes happening.
So it's about giving them options and support,
Right.
not forcing them down one specific path.
Exactly. But we do need to look at the other side of the coin as well.
Okay.
What about those risks
Right.
and side effects?
Because those are real too.
Oh, absolutely. We can't just pretend that there are no risks.
Right.
Some of the common concerns are things like, bone density,
Okay.
future fertility,
Okay.
and psychological development. And, those are definitely things we have to consider. But it's also important to point out that a lot of those potential risks are still being studied.
Right.
We don't fully understand the long-term effects yet.
Okay, so it's that lack of long-term data that seems to be driving a lot of the anxiety around this?
It definitely is. And it's totally understandable that parents,
Yeah.
healthcare providers, and policymakers want to be cautious.
Of course.
We were talking about young people who are still growing, but that caution needs to be balanced against the potential harm
Right.
of denying care to those who might really benefit from it.
So it's that balancing act again,
It is.
like with so many things in life.
Yeah, how do we weigh those known and unknown risks
Yeah.
against the potential benefits and the very real suffering that some of these kids are going through?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And there's not an easy answer, is there?
Not really. It requires us to,
Yeah.
think carefully about each person's individual needs.
Hmm.
The evidence we have and the consequences of each choice.
Yeah. So it sounds like we need a lot more research,
Yeah,
more data, more open dialogue
absolutely.
to really make informed decisions about this.
And I think it's important to remember that, science is a process.
Right.
It's ongoing. We're constantly learning and refining our understanding.
Right.
What we think is true today might change tomorrow as we get new research.
Totally.
And that's okay.
Right.
That's how science works.
That's a great reminder.
Yeah.
We need to be open to new information
Right.
and be ready to change our views as we learn more.
Exactly. And I think that openness
Yeah.
needs to apply to everyone in this debate.
Right.
We need to be willing to listen to each other,
Yeah.
consider different viewpoints,
Mm-hmm.
and have those respectful conversations, even when we don't agree.
It's about finding that common ground,
Exactly.
the shared desire
Yeah.
to support and care for young people,
Exactly.
even if we disagree about how to do that.
And recognizing that this isn't just a scientific issue.
Yeah.
It's a human issue.
Yeah.
At the end of the day,
Mhm.
this is about real people, their well-being, and their right to live as their true selves.
We've covered so much today.
Yeah.
Diving into all the complexities of this UK decision
Yeah.
to ban puberty blockers for kids experiencing gender dysphoria.
Right.
We explored the science,
Yeah.
the ethics, the personal stories,
Yeah.
the global context.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, and there are no easy answers.
Definitely not.
But we hope this discussion gave you something to think about and maybe even spark some new questions.
Yeah, keep learning, keep exploring.
Exactly, because learning is a journey,
It is.
not a destination.
And it's through that open-minded exploration and those respectful conversations that we can move forward together towards a world where all individuals feel seen, heard, and respected.
I love that. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me
On this deep dive. And until next time,
Yeah.
stay curious, stay informed, and keep those conversations going.